In 2015, archaeologists in the UK announced a wooden artifact, approximately 16 centimeters long, pulled from the mud of an ancient ditch. At first, many laughed it off, calling it a ritual object or a crude medieval prank. But then, surface analyses began to silence the entire research community. That piece of wood was not worn down like a standard labor tool. The polished wear marks were concentrated in exact positions indicating it had been gripped, rubbed, and repeatedly used over a very long period of time. And if that object was truly used for physiological purposes, it means that behind the sermons on abstinence in medieval Europe existed an entire secret, filthy, and pathogen-ridden sexual life that history has desperately tried to bury for hundreds of years. Fact 1. Medieval people were more obsessed with physical desires than you think. If you only look at church paintings or the surviving moral codes of 14th century Europe, you would assume this was an incredibly austere society. Priests constantly preached about purity. Carnal pleasure outside the purpose of procreation was deemed a sin. Adultery could get a person publicly shamed in the town square. Self-gratification was described as an act that defiled the soul. On the surface, everything looked like a world where humans only knew how to pray, labor, and fear hell. But reality was vastly different. You can ban behavior. You cannot turn off human biological desire. Stepping outside the incense-filled cathedrals, medieval Europe reveals itself as a society brimming with physical repression. Thousands of soldiers living for months in barracks, surrounded only by mud, blood, and war. Sailors drifting at sea for half a year in cramped, foul-smelling quarters devoid of women. Even the aristocracy fared no better. Many marriages were merely cold political transactions between houses, where two people shared a bed but had virtually no emotional connection or genuine desire. And when the need doesn't disappear, it finds a way to leak into the darkest corners of society. Prostitution districts sprang up around major cities much faster than many realized. One of the most famous examples was located in Southwark, south of the River Thames in London, an area filled with taverns, brothels, and gambling dens. The irony is that many historical documents show this area was actually under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Winchester. The women working there were even branded with a highly sarcastic moniker, Winchester Geese. By day, the church preached abstinence. By night, money from the brothel districts continued to flow into the pockets of those in power. That was when a clandestine market began to form. Not everyone could publicly seek out a partner. Not everyone dared to step into a brothel amidst a society riddled with prejudice and disease. And so, many began seeking out secret support tools to relieve their personal desires in silence. The problem was, this was an era before medical-grade plastic, before silicone, before any modern concept of sterilization. The craftsmen of the time had to utilize whatever materials lay around them to create intimate anatomical replicas. And when you look at what they actually used to craft them, you will understand why the boundary between pleasure and infection in the Middle Ages was terrifyingly thin. Fact 2. What were the first dildos made of? Medieval people may not have possessed modern technology, but physiological needs and physical desires had existed since the dawn of time. In medieval Europe, when all extramarital pleasure was viewed with highly suspicious eyes, craftsmen began taking special orders that were certainly never advertised in their shop windows. By day, they built tables and chairs, repaired carriage wheels, or forged cutlery. But when night fell, and a regular customer slipped in through the back door. The conversation sometimes shifted to much more discreet items. No receipts, no advertisements, and certainly, no one wanted to be caught carrying home a piece of wood with an overly explicit shape. The materials used depended entirely on the buyer's purse. Wealthy aristocrats sometimes commissioned items made of ivory or animal horn, which were filed smooth and polished quite meticulously. Some were even engraved with patterns to give them a more refined feel. When you had enough money, even secrecy had its own luxury version. But for the vast majority of commoners, the choices were far more practical: wood, rolled fabric, or animal skin stuffed with wool. Logs of oak or ash were whittled down with a carving knife, then smeared with lard or beeswax to reduce friction. It sounds like a rustic handicraft, but in terms of hygiene, it was an absolute disaster of an idea. No matter how smoothly it was sanded, the wooden surface still harbored countless microscopic crevices. When exposed to moisture and bodily fluids, they quickly sucked the liquid deep into the grain. And remember, this was an era where people didn't even understand what bacteria were, had no concept of sterilization, and many families even shared the same basin of water to wash their faces. After a while, the item began to change its odor. Damp stains spread along the wood grain, dark mold spots appeared, and the pungent, earthy stench of organic matter rotting from the inside out emerged. Repeated friction could also cause microscopic splinters to flake off right into the one place no one on Earth ever wants a wooden splinter. And that was just the wooden version, to create a softer feel. Some craftsmen began using animal skin stuffed with wool or sheep's fleece. In theory, this was considered an upgraded version. In reality, it acted more like a moisture-retaining incubation pouch for bacteria. The internal wool layer absorbed liquids aggressively, while the external animal skin retained heat and moisture exceptionally well. After multiple uses, the item easily became slimy, discolored, and reeked of the sharp, sour odor of decomposing organic matter. If left for long in a damp, enclosed room, it became the perfect breeding ground for mold. The disturbing part is that many people at the time had absolutely no idea what was happening. They only noticed that the longer they used it, the more it had a strange smell, sometimes causing burning pain after use. But rarely did anyone link that to disease or infection. The desire persisted, but medical knowledge simply couldn't keep up. And things got vastly worse when these items appeared in crowded environments, like medieval brothels. Fact 3. Medieval brothels were filthier than you think. To truly grasp the level of unhygienic terror surrounding these tools, you have to place them in the exact environment where they likely appeared: the brothels of 14th century London or Paris. Try pushing open that creaky wooden door. There are no seductive red lights or luxurious perfumes, as modern movies often imagine. The air inside was thick with body heat, and the concept of ventilation was virtually non-existent. The sweat of bodies unwashed for weeks mingled with spilled ale on the floorboards, rotting straw beneath the beds, the smoke of animal fat candles, and the stench of open sewers drifting in from the window. The floors were always damp and sticky. The corners of the room were pitch black. Rats scurried near table legs. Blankets and bedding were rarely washed in any real sense. They were usually just brushed off and used for the next guest. This was not a romantic scene from a novel. It was a continuous assembly line consuming lust, operating in conditions of near-zero hygiene, and if these support tools were genuinely used in such an environment. The risk of contamination was almost inescapable, but the most horrific part did not lie in the materials. It lay in the fact that many of these items likely didn't belong to any one person in particular. An item might be used, hastily wiped down with an old rag, and immediately put away or passed to someone else. No boiling water, no disinfectants. They simply used it, passing it from hand to hand, with no one understanding that such a damp, dark surface was the ultimate utopia for microorganisms to thrive. Over time, the outer animal skin could discolor from the buildup of body oils and grime. The wooden items gradually absorbed moisture, emitting the faint sour stench of degrading organic matter. In many cramped inns or brothels, they were likely stuffed into damp bedside drawers, where mold and insects proliferated everywhere. Medieval people could not see bacteria. They didn't know what microbiology was. But that didn't mean their bodies were immune to the consequences. And just days after these secret trysts, the price began to show. Fact 4. The most terrifying thing wasn't the desire. It was what came with it. 14th century Europeans could erect massive stone cathedrals. But when it came to bacteria, they were almost entirely blind. They believed illnesses came from toxic miasma, demons, or the wrath of God, when in reality, the source of infection often lay in incredibly mundane objects, dirty, damp surfaces, uncleaned tools, or tiny unnoticed scratches. A few days after their secret indulgences, the body would start sending warning signals. Initially, it was just a tingling itch or a few small red spots. But very soon after, the sensitive skin would begin to burn, swell, and throb with pain. Scratches caused by rough surfaces could become infected, ooze fluids, or led to prolonged fevers. Some severe cases even emitted foul odors from the inflamed areas. Simply walking became sheer agony. But instead of receiving proper medical treatment, many believed they were being punished for their carnal lust. The most terrifying thing is that they had absolutely no idea where the true cause lay. No one knew those inflammatory lesions existed for biological reasons. No one understood that dirty, damp objects could become vectors for pathogens. And no one realized their bodies were becoming victims of the very medical ignorance of their era. Consequently, inflammatory and fungal diseases silently spread through many European cities. Women were often the ones bearing the heaviest consequences. Many had to live for months with excruciating pain, severe infections, and abnormal body odors, yet dared not tell anyone for fear of being branded as unclean or depraved. And that was the most terrifying, vicious cycle. The more it hurt, the more they stayed silent. The more they stayed silent, the worse the condition became. That is the true horror of this era. Not the desire itself, but the fact that humans stepped into it while completely blind to the biological consequences, allowing ignorance to silently destroy their bodies from the inside out. And as these consequences surfaced more and more, the ruling class and the church didn't seek to solve the root of the problem. They chose a much simpler option, pretending none of it ever existed. Fact 5. The church didn't want them to exist in history. That is why today, if you scour the archives regarding medieval Europe, there are almost no official documents directly describing these items. They appear as blurry shadows in history mentioned in passing, renamed, or erased completely from the records. Because their existence was a massive slap in the face to the sermons on purity and abstinence that the church preached every single day. At the pulpit, the clergy spoke of controlling desires, keeping the body pure, and avoiding sinful lust. But in the real world, humans still possessed physiological needs just like any other era. and that created a contradiction the ruling class desperately wanted to bury. Therefore, over centuries, numerous related artifacts were destroyed, hidden, or intentionally wiped from history. When sensitive items were discovered during raids on brothels or residential areas, the most common protocol was simple: throw them straight into the fire. No archiving, no analysis, no scientific notes. Just burn it all, as if throwing that piece of wood into the flames would make human desire vanish along with it. Some monasteries and archives even had regulations restricting detailed records of deviant behaviors, believing that publicly describing such things would corrupt society even further. Consequently, many things that genuinely existed in real life were transformed into voids in history. They didn't deny it completely. They just pretended it wasn't worth mentioning. But history's most amusing trick lies elsewhere, renaming the artifacts. In archaeology, there is a rather bitter running joke: if you dig up something too bizarre or too sensitive to explain, just call it a ritual object. And indeed, many artifacts with exceedingly explicit shapes were branded with far more innocent names. A suspicious-looking wooden object was suddenly catalogued as a household tool. An elongated object was dubbed a herbal grinding pestle. Some artifacts were even poetically described as fertility symbols serving harvest rituals. In other words, many early scholars preferred turning it into a spiritual relic, rather than admitting their ancestors possessed the exact same physiological needs as modern humans. And the funny thing is, that evasion tactic lasted for a very long time, for decades, whenever something slightly sensitive was unearthed. The research community practically went into automatic feigned ignorance. An item's purpose could be obvious at a glance, yet they still managed to write descriptions like object bearing an unidentified symbolic meaning. After reading it, you just want to ask, what kind of symbol fits perfectly in the hand? Like that? History is sometimes not distorted by massive conspiracies. It gets distorted simply because humans are afraid of blushing. But the problem with mud is it keeps secrets for a long time. Not forever. And then, when a bizarre artifact was dug up from the mud in Britain, the entire archaeological world was plunged into a debate about something no one wanted to call by its real name. Fact 6. The controversial archaeological discovery. The truth lies in the wear marks on the wood. Fast forward to the modern era. Inside a freezing laboratory under white lights and the humming of scanning machines. At the excavation site near the Vindolanda Fort in Britain, archaeologists pulled a wooden object, about 16 centimeters long, from an ancient ditch. Although the artifact belonged to the Roman era, it cracked open questions about similar objects in subsequent periods. What sent chills down researchers' spines was not the age of the item, but the fact that it reflected a type of secret behavior that persisted long after, extending straight through the Middle Ages, as soon as images of the artifact were published. Academia immediately split into factions. One group rushed to offer safe explanations. Some said it was a weaving tool. Others called it a spice pestle. Some scholars even described it as a fertility symbol bearing ritual significance. Simply put, they were willing to call it anything, as long as it wasn't the thing everyone was actually thinking of. The spectacle was sometimes so comical it resembled a group meeting of people trying their hardest not to look at the elephant in the room. The piece of wood was sitting right there on the table. The shape was unmistakably obvious. Yet the entire group seriously debated whether it might be a communal textile support tool. However, The morphological research team didn't care much for that embarrassment. They looked straight at the physical evidence. The wood was scanned under surface analyzers, and the wear marks began to tell a story that was very hard to deny. First was the size and shape. It suspiciously matched human anatomy. But the detail that blew the debate wide open lay in the areas that had been worn smooth. The surface was not worn evenly like a standard labor tool. If this were a pestle or a production tool, the middle section should have borne the brunt of the force. But reality was the exact opposite. The two areas worn down the most aggressively were at the base and the tip, while the middle section was significantly less deformed. That is the exact type of wear produced by repeated friction and manual gripping. And that wasn't all. Under the microscope, researchers noted that the surface layer in certain spots had been polished to a point where the natural roughness of the ash wood was almost completely gone. And ash wood is not soft. It is quite hard and durable. It doesn't naturally become that glossy and smooth after just a few uses or a few random bumps. To create that level of wear, the object had to have been rubbed continuously over an extremely long period of time. In other words, someone used it heavily. And in that very moment, the atmosphere in the debate shifted completely. People began to look at that piece of wood in a different light. It was no longer a savim, somewhat amusing item sitting in an archaeological glass case. It became the direct physical trace of real flesh and blood bodies that had touched it hundreds of years ago. If this truly was a physiological support tool, then how many people had used it? How much sweat? How many pathogens? And how much bodily fluid had seeped into every fiber of that wood? How many dark rooms? How many inns? How many brothels? And how many hands had it passed through before being tossed into a ditch full of mud and garbage? And the question that made many shudder the most was that item a personal belonging? Or was it shared? Because if it was the latter, then what lay before the archaeologists wasn't just a curiosity, it was akin to an ancient microbial incubator, preserved by mud for centuries. That piece of wood cannot speak, but the wear marks on it can. And the closer people looked at the object buried in the mud, the more they realized a very uncomfortable truth. Medieval Europe was nowhere near as pure as the paintings, history books, or dogmas had desperately tried to portray. Fact 7. The dark truth about medieval people. Movies often lead us to think of the Middle Ages as an era of knights, churches, and people living austere lives under strict religious laws. In popular imagination, it is a world of prayers, rough cloaks, and almost absolute abstinence. But real life was filthier, hotter, and vastly more suffocating. Behind the freezing stone walls of the church, brothels continued to operate steadily every night. The alleys behind the taverns were still filled with rapid fleshly transactions conducted under flickering candlelight. Sailors fresh off the docks, mercenaries, long-distance merchants, and even the nobility all slipped into those places to relieve the desires that daytime society forced them to deny. By day, people preached about sin. By night, those very same cities operated on lust. Infections spread silently through the bodies of urban dwellers. People coughed, ran fevers, felt burning pain, and developed ulcers, yet had no idea what was happening inside them. Some women had to live for months with horrific pelvic pain while desperately staying silent for fear of being branded as unclean. Many men simply kept drinking, kept visiting brothels, and kept infecting others without ever knowing what they were carrying inside their bodies. And in those damp inn rooms, thick with the smell of sweat, stale ale, and rotting straw, items made of wood or animal skin were hidden beneath dirty blankets, waiting until dark. That is the least discussed part of the Middle Ages, a society constantly trying to appear moral on the surface, but churning with physiological repression and behaviors forced to occur in secret underneath. Humans do not change their instincts just because someone is standing on a pulpit preaching. Desires do not vanish just because laws forbid them. The brains, hormones, and bodies of medieval people operated almost exactly the same as ours do today. It's just that everything was forced to live in the shadows. And when everything must happen in secret with no medical knowledge, no hygiene, no concept of sterilization, no understanding of what the invisible or contagious even was, the human body became the test subject for the very ignorance of the era. An infected person didn't know where it came from. No one thought a shared object could carry disease. A minor wound caused by a wooden splinter could easily turn into an infection lasting for months. In their minds, everything was simply explained away by karma, toxic miasma, demons, or the punishment of God. That is what the artifact at Vindolanda exposes most clearly. A worn-out piece of wood lying in the mud stripped bare an entire layer of life that history had tried to conceal. It showed that medieval people were not as transcendent as many believed. They still had needs, secrets, desires, shame, illicit encounters, and the fear of being caught exactly like modern humans. The only difference is that modern humans have antibiotics, antibacterial soap, and medical knowledge. And they did not. They lived in a world teeming with pathogens, but no one knew what they were. A world where humans could slowly die just because they used a moldy piece of wood, and then prayed for months while still completely unable to comprehend what was eating their bodies from the inside out. Ending the legacy of ignorance. Perhaps the most terrifying part of this story does not lie in the shape of the artifact, but in what once happened around it. Imagine a pitch-black inn-room hundreds of years ago. Moldy wooden floors, the air thick with the smell of sweat, cheap ale, and smoke from animal fat candles. Someone is holding that object in their hand, completely unaware that its surface is teeming with germs, fungi, and bodily fluids from countless people before them. Then, that object continues to be passed to the next person. No one knows they are introducing pathogens into their own bodies. No one understands why. A few days later, their skin begins to burn. Why the prolonged fever won't break, or why their body slowly rots from the inside. That is the darkest part of history. Not the lust, but the fact that humans stepped into it while completely blind to the consequences. They didn't die from pleasure. They died from ignorance. And ironically, many of them even believed that all that agony was due to demons, karmic punishment, or evil miasma, when the true cause was simply a moldy piece of wood passed through multiple bodies. What do you think is the most terrifying aspect of this era? Is it the dogmas that forced humans to live in shame, or the fact that they completely failed to understand what was silently destroying their bodies? Leave your thoughts in the comments section. And if you want to continue uncovering the filthiest, most abrasive, and least discussed corners of history, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because the deeper we dig into the mud of the past, the more we realize that humans were never quite as civilized as we like to believe.